Welcome to my classroom. As you can see, it's a little small and awkward because we are a converted office building. So our space here is limited, much like my lab space. This is it. I have one sink and a small counter, and I need to do all of my lab prep here. So one day, hopefully with this grant, I will be able to take out these computer desks and put in a separate lab bench. Right now, my students carry out all the labs on their tables. I have to prep all of my labs in my office and then bring them out to students during class time. If I had a lab bench, I would be able to prep all of my labs here, have them ready before the students even enter the classroom, and it will make my lab days more efficient, and it will allow my students to be able to differentiate lab work versus classwork, which they can't do right now. If we look into my closet, in here I have one functioning microscope. It's a little dated. My students think that the monocular is a little difficult to use. And personally, I think only having one functioning microscope for a high school classroom is really not okay. I would love to have more microscopes to allow my marine biology class to look at, identify, and draw plankton. And it would allow my biology class to look at cells and different organisms. And so having more scopes can allow more stations and just allow my students to get more in depth with the material. I have two of these balances. My students have to use gram stackers to get the masses of any object. So this is not terribly accurate or reliable, and it's not preparing my students for what they're going to see past high school or in the workforce. So we really could use some digital scales. In here, I have an abundance of things to make slides. However, with one functioning microscope, it makes it really difficult to utilize and for my students to utilize. So these, unfortunately, hardly ever get used. I have a whole bunch of test tubes. I use them for labs like a pigment extraction lab out of leaves for photosynthesis. I use them for a liver enzyme lab for macromolecules and for CO2 yeast labs. However, my one test tube rack, they don't fit in. So we often use beakers as our test tube racks, which is not terribly safe or, good science practice. So having a few extra test tube racks would allow my students to have more efficient lab time as well. We are in need of updated and relevant equipment so that all of my science classes can have a 21st century education. I would love to get sensors for my physical science class so they can track velocity and acceleration and environmental and aquatic parameters in real time. This would allow them to be able to design and manipulate their own experiments, and it allows them to give and have more ownership of their learning. I need to be able to give my students a better, if not comparable, science education here as to what they would get at the regular high school. Because we are an alternative school, we get students who traditional classrooms didn't work for them or they fell through the cracks. And so I need to be able to give them hands-on, real-world science in order for them to really succeed. And my thought is that if I can engage my students in science in my classroom, then they're likely to come and stay on campus, go to all their classes, and hopefully potentially graduate. Every semester I ask my students what I could do to better my class for them. And every year they always say more experiments. They want hands-on stuff.
I think that having better equipment would help us do more labs, which would help with learning, because I'm like a person who personally learns better from hands-on activity. A lot of kids here in the alternative school are like that too, and we got to do less labs just because we don't have as much equipment.
I think we should have more and accurate science equipment, because we don't have a lot of good stuff to use around here, and having that be in there as a utensil that we can use would be really beneficial for our learning and for the jobs that are going to be opened up to us.
Thank you for considering my students for this grant and for funding science education.